morning for the session Kropotkin's Archives, with two presentations that are very interesting and make it worth your morning. The first one would be Natalia Portnova from the Dmitrov Kremlin Museum Reserve, who will have a presentation called, sorry if I mispronounce, Dmitrov Letters of Piotr Kropotkin out of the funds of Dmitrov Kremlin State Museum Preserve. So the presentation will be in Russian, but we have a link to a Google document that I'm just sharing now in the chat, and if you need it later again, please don't hesitate to ask. The next one will be Shaun Pitt with the presentation, the Kropotkin Papers and the Personal Networks of Piotr Kropotkin, who is a PhD student at Northumbria University and is aiming to finish soon, and will talk to us about his experience and his future project, if not wrong. So we hope the presentation will last a bit under an hour, or an hour top, but then it will leave plenty of time for more discussion if people fancy it. And yeah, so Natalia, if you want to start, please go ahead.
Следующий слайд.
Next slide.
Все, начинаем, да? Эпистолярное наследие Петра Кропоткина чрезвычайно велико и недостаточно исследовано. Оно представляет большой интерес для исследователей его научного наследия. Английский исследователь Слеттер предполагал, что общее количество только сохранившихся писем Кропоткина составляет около 2000. Наверное, сейчас по-английски это можно, потому что я не вижу английского текста, да? Хотя бы в двух словах.
Сказать, да?
Да.
So the epistolary heritage of Piotr Kropotkin is extremely large and insufficiently researched. It is of great interest to researchers of his scientific heritage. The English researcher's letter assumed that the total number of letters only preserved is about 2000. Next.
Нет. Немногие исследователи жизни Кропоткина обращались к его письмам. Причин этому много. Большое количество самих писем, разнообразная география как адресатов, так и архивов, в которых они хранятся, использование нескольких языков как во всей переписке, так и в рамках одного письма.
So few researchers of the life of Piotr Kropotkin turn to his letters. There are many reasons for this. A large number of letters themselves, a diverse geography of both recipients of the archives in which they are stored, the use of several languages both in the entire correspondence and within one letter.
К настоящему времени опубликовано около 1000 писем Кропоткина примерно 85 адресатам. Самая большая публикация содержит 376 писем Кропоткина Марии Сидоровне Гольдсмит, а также нескольким другим лицам. Известный двухтомник писем братьев Кропоткиных содержит 140 писем Петра Алексеевича брату и 62 письма брата Александра ему. 35 писем было написано канадскому экономисту, профессору университета в Торонто Джеймсу Мейвору.
To date, about 1000 letters of Kropotkin have been published to about 85 recipients. The largest publication contains 376 letters of Kropotkin to Maria Sidorovna Goldsmith, as well as to several other persons. The famous two-volume collection of letters of the Kropotkin brothers contains 140 letters of Peter Kropotkin to his brother and 62 response letters. 35 letters to the Canadian economist, professor of the University of Toronto, James Mavor, for the... Okay.
Особняком...
Next slide, please.
Нет, назад.
Back, please. Okay.
Назад.
Okay.
Да. Особняком среди публикаций стоит обширная работа, проделанная Максом Нетлау. Статья содержит выдержки примерно из 140 писем, адресованных различным лицам. Письма расположены в хронологическом порядке с комментариями публикатора. Особую ценность работе придает то, что некоторые из этих писем в настоящее время утрачены так и не дождавшись полноценной публикации.
Apart from the publications is the extensive work done by Max Nitlau. The article contains excerpts from about 140 letters addressed to various persons. The letters are arranged in chronological order with the comments of the publisher. The special value of the work is given by the fact that some of these letters are currently lost without waiting for a full-fledged publication.
Следующий слайд.
Next slide, please. Okay.
Вышеперечисленные факты взяты мною из доклада исследователя наследия Петра Алексеевича Кропоткина Андрея Викторовича Бирюкова, с которым мне непродолжительное время повезло быть знакомой и который увлек меня изучением эпистолярного наследия Петра Кропоткина. Собирание и изучение этого эпистолярного наследия вылилось у Андрея Викторовича в каталогизацию всех писем Кропоткина, опубликованных и неопубликованных, оставленными незавершенными из-за преждевременного ухода исследователя в 2018 году. Его каталог содержит данные о 1800 с небольшим кропоткинских письмах. Он, конечно же, далеко не полон. Вместе с тем, составляя его, Андрей Викторович заметил, что простой хронологический перечень писем Кропоткин, как правило, датировал письма и указывал свой адрес, служит не просто справочником, но и конвой биографической летописи. Письма позволяют уточнять хронологию многих событий его биографии, даты поездок, встреч, выхода книг и статей и тому подобное.
The above facts are taken by me from the report of the researcher of the heritage of Kropotkin, Andrei Viktorovich Biryukov, with whom I was lucky to be acquainted for a short time, and who fascinated me with the study of the epistolary heritage of Peter Kropotkin. Collecting and studying the epistolary heritage resulted in the idea of cataloging all Kropotkin's letters, published and unpublished, left unfinished due to the premature departure of the researcher in 2018. His catalog contains data on 1,800 and a little Kropotkin letters. It is, of course, far from complete. At the same time, when compiling it, the author noticed a simple chronological list of letters. Kropotkin, as a rule, dated letters and indicated his address. Serves not just as a reference book, but also as a canvas of a biographical chronicle. Letters allow us to clarify the chronology of many events of his biography, dates of trips, meetings, publications of books and articles, etc.
Next slide.
Next slide, please.
Please. Именно об этом писал первый собиратель эпистолярного наследия Кропоткина Макс Нитлау. В письмах к близким друзьям Кропоткин касался всего, что тревожило его деятельный ум в данный момент. В письмах же своих к лицам не столь близким Кропоткин дает пространные объяснения и взвешивает слова, как будто он говорит их с трибуны. В отрывках, приведенных выше, содержится больше данных о ходе его идей или о событиях и переменах в его личной жизни, чем в значительном числе его биографий. Кроме опубликования этих материалов, чтобы дать возможность друзьям Кропоткина и товарищам провести еще несколько часов с ним наедине, мы еще преследовали цель напомнить о необходимости собрания и издания всей переписки Кропоткина как заслуживающей сохранения для потомства.
This is what the first collector of Kropotkin's epistolary heritage, Max Nitlau, wrote about. In letters to close friends, Kropotkin touched on everything that disturbed his active mind at the moment. In his letters to people not so close, Kropotkin gives lengthy explanations and weighs the words as if he says them from the podium. The excerpts given above contain more information about the course of his ideas or about events and changes of his personal life than in a significant number of his biographies. In addition to publishing these materials, in order to give Kropotkin's friends and comrades an opportunity to spend a few more hours alone with him, we also pursue the goal of recalling the need to collect and publish all of Kropotkin's correspondence as worthy of preservation for posterity.
Next slide, please.
Okay.
Да.
Right.
Письма Кропоткина хранятся во многих архивах России. Среди них следует упомянуть Государственный архив Российской Федерации, Историческую библиотеку, Российскую государственную библиотеку, бывшую Ленинку. Архив музея-заповедника Дмитровский Кремль тоже бережно хранит кропоткинское наследие. Количество писем Кропоткина, его жены, дочери и писем к ним исчисляется 500 единиц хранения. Они написаны на 4 языках – русском, английском, французском, немецком.
Kropotkin's letters are stored in many archives in Russia. Among them, we should mention the famous GOV, the Historical Library, the Russian State Library, formerly Leninka, the archive of the Dmitrov Kremlin Museum Reserve also carefully preserves the Kropotkin heritage. The number of Kropotkin's letters to his wife, daughter, and letters to them is estimated at 500 storage units. They are written in 4 languages: Russian, English, French, German.
Тематика писем весьма разнообразна. Анализ политической жизни в разных странах, научные исследования, издательская деятельность, события личной жизни и так далее. Next slide, please.
The subject matter of the letters is very diverse. Analysis of political life in different countries, scientific research, publishing activities, personal life events, and so on.
Нам прежде всего интересны те письма, которые относятся к дмитровскому периоду жизни Петра Алексеевича и его семьи в период с июля 1918 года по февраль 1921 года.
We are primarily interested in those letters that relate to the Dmitrov period of the life of Piotr Alexeyevich and his family in the period from July 1918 to February 1921. Next slide, please.
В рамках небольшого доклада невозможно проанализировать не только тематику писем Кропоткина, но и перечислить всех адресатов. Поэтому мы решили остановиться на небольшой теме, которую условно назвали «Сельскохозяйственные пристрастия семьи Кропоткиных во время жизни в Дмитрове».
Within the framework of a small report, it is impossible to analyze not only the subject of Kropotkin's letters, but also to list all the recipients. Therefore, we decided to focus on a small topic, which was conditionally called the agricultural preferences of the Kropotkin family during their life in Dmitrov. Next slide, please.
Тема огородничества была близка и понятна семье Кропоткиных задолго до переезда в Дмитров. За долгие годы жизни в Англии Софья Григорьевна возделывала крошечный огород в Харроу под Лондоном, где выращивала капусту, овощи и даже виноград в крохотной теплице. Она была естественницей, так называли себя студентки Женевского университета, где и получала образование Софья Григорьевна. А позже Кропоткины будут жить в пригороде Лондона Бромли и в небольшом городке Брайтоне на берегу Ла-Манша. И везде перед домом будут небольшие садики.
Okay. The topic of gardening was close and understandable to the family of Piotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin long before moving to Dmitrov. For many years of her life in England, Sofia Grigorievna cultivated a tiny vegetable garden in Harrow, near London, where she grew cabbage, vegetables, and even grapes in a tiny greenhouse. She was a natural scientist, as the students of the University of Geneva called themselves, where Sofia Grigorievna received her education. Later, the Kropotkins will live in the London suburb of Bromley and the small town of Brighton on the English Channel. And everywhere in front of the house there will be a small garden that will evoke memories of the motherland and make it possible to grow vegetables according to a purely English tradition. Next slide, please.
Воспоминания о лондонских садиках перед домом не остались без внимания Софьи Григорьевны и в трудные годы после возвращения на родину. В архиве музея-заповедника Дмитровский Кремль в фонде Кропоткина хранится уникальный документ, лекция Софьи Григорьевны Кропоткиной, которая называется «Интенсивное огородничество как заработок для интеллигенции», которая была прочитана 21 февраля или 11 марта по новому стилю 1918 года.
Memories of the London gardens in front of the house didn't remain without attention of Sofia Grigorievna even in the difficult years after her return to the homeland. The archive of Dmitrov State Museum preserve in the Kropotkin Foundation inventory one case number 111 contains a unique document, lecture by Sofia Grigorievna Kropotkina, Intensive Gardening as Earnings for the Intelligentsia, read on February 21st, New Style, March 11, 1918, clarifying the place where the lecture was given is a matter of scientific study, but we are interested in a small excerpt.
Вот небольшой отрывочек из этой лекции. В Англии каждый домик с небольшим количеством земли, которая раньше была засажена цветами, засажена картофель, картофель и картофель, но везде предлагают воздерживаться весной от употребления картофеля, благодаря чему картофель была дешевле назначенной правительством цены. Этот громадный переворот произвели интеллигентные женщины, которых насчитывается около 30 тысяч. Они работают около ферм, не считая тех, которые засаживают овощами свои огороды. И если бы не женщины, то Англия теперь находилась бы в продовольственном отношении в таком же состоянии, в котором теперь находится Россия. Это 1918 год. Я далека звать нашу интеллигенцию на поле. Крестьяне опомнятся и все равно возьмутся за дело. Интеллигенция должна приняться за интенсивное огородничество и производить картофель, капусту, огурцы, больше раннюю картофель, которую можно получить с некоторым пониманием дела в конце июня и даже раньше.
So, here is a short extract. In England, every house with a small amount of land that was previously planted with flowers, everywhere you will see potatoes, potatoes, and potatoes. But everywhere they offer to refrain from eating potatoes in the spring, so that potatoes were cheaper than the price set by the government. This huge revolution was made by intelligent women, of whom there are about 30,000. They work near farms, not counting those who plant vegetables in their gardens. And if it were not for women, England would now be in the same state in terms of food that Russia is now in. And this was written in 1918. I am far from calling our intelligentsia to the field. The peasants will come to their senses and will still take up the matter. The intelligentsia should start intensive gardening and produce potatoes, cabbage, cucumbers, more early potatoes, which can be obtained with some understanding of the matter at the end of June and even earlier.
Маленькое дополнение. В 1918 году слово «картофель» имеет женский род.
A little addition, please. In 1918, the word potatoes is of so to say, female gender.
Женский
Yeah.
род, да. Призывая интеллигенцию личным трудом на приусадебных участках и на огороде помогать своим семьям выжить в трудное время после революционной разрухи и начавшейся гражданской войны, Софья Григорьевна не осталась в стороне. И большую часть положений этой лекции она претворила в жизнь на приусадебном участке в доме Алсуфьева в Дмитрове.
Calling on the intelligentsia to help their families survive in the difficult time of the post-revolutionary devastation, the outbreak of civil war, with their personal work on the homesteads and in the gardens. Sofia Grigorievna didn't stand aside. She implemented most of the provisions of this lecture on the homestead in the Alsufyev house in Dmitrov. Next slide, please.
Петр Алексеевич с уважением относился к сельскохозяйственным пристрастиям жены, с горделивостью писал об этом в письмах, восторгался правильностью ее грядок и богатым урожаем перед английскими и русскими друзьями. А Софья Григорьевна часто выступала с лекциями перед самыми разными слушателями на тему огородничества. Это увлечение стало играть очень важную роль в жизни семьи в Дмитрове.
Piotr Alexeyevich respected his wife's agricultural preferences, wrote about it with pride in letters, admired the correctness of her beds, and a rich harvest in front of English and Russian friends. Sofia Grigorievna often gave lectures on a variety of listeners on the topic of gardening. This hobby began to play a very important role in the life of the family in Dmitrov. Next slide, please.
Дом, в котором поселились Кропоткины в июле 1918 года, принадлежал ранее бывшему предводителю дмитровских дворян, графу Михаилу Адамовичу Алсуфьеву. К сожалению, не сохранилось описание дома и усадьбы с момента строительства дома в 1898 году и до продажи его Кропоткиным в августе 1918 года. Но можно смело предположить, что усадьба Алсуфьева, занимающая площадь 4000 квадратных метров, была цветущим садом, так как практически все воспоминания о Дмитрове конца XIX – начала XX века изобилуют фразами о наличии большого количества садов. До садов. Вот отсюда. Да, и все.
Okay. The house in which the Kropotkins settled in July 1918 belonged to the former leader of the Dmitrov nobles, Count Mikhail Adamovich Alsufyev. Unfortunately, the description of the house and the estate has not been preserved since the construction of the house in 1898 and before its sale by Kropotkin August 1918. But we can safely assume that the Alsufyev estate, covering an area of 4,000 square meters, was a blooming garden, since almost all memories of Dmitrov of the late 19th century, early 20th century, abound with phrases about the presence of a large number of gardens.
Так как в Москве жить было очень трудно, Софья Григорьевна решила сразу же развести на приусадебном участке огород. Вот что удалось найти в письмах Кропоткина, написанных во время жизни в Дмитрове. Несколько цитат из писем Дмитровского периода.
Okay. Since it was very difficult to live in Moscow, Sofia Grigorievna decided to immediately plant a vegetable garden on the plot. Here is what we managed to find in the letters of Piotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin written during his life in Dmitrov. Here are just a few interesting fragments from the letters of Piotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin.
12 апреля 1919 года. Пишу вам также с просьбой. Софья Григорьевна в сумме мечтает обработать ту часть земли, которая имеется при занимаемом нами доме, под огород. Земля есть, а семян, сколько она и наши знакомые не стараются, достать не могут. Не надо, просто да.
So, one letter. April the 12th, 1919. I'm also writing to you with a request. Sofia Grigorievna is always dreaming of cultivating that part of the land that is available at the house we occupy for a vegetable garden. The land is there, and the seeds, how much it and our friends do not try, but they cannot get in.
26 июня 1919 года. Пока мы остаемся в Дмитрове, Соня насадила довольно большой огород. Если не пропадут труды, то на зиму будут большей частью свои овощи.
Another yet letter, June 26th, 1919. For now, we are staying in Dmitrov. Sonia planted a fairly large vegetable garden. If the work is not lost, then for the winter they will mostly have their own vegetables.
29
Next slide,
июня,
please.
да, 29 июня 2019 года доктору Атабекяну. Соня поглощена огородничеством и идет успешно, уже пользуется кое-чем. Доктору Атабекяну.
To Dr. Atapekyan from Dmitrov, Moscow region. The letter is dated as 29th of June 1919. Sonia is absorbed in gardening and it is going well. We are already using something.
Следующее пропустим и вот это вот,
So
25.
we move to...
Нет, давайте я вначале. 25 июля 1920 года. Конечно, постарели. То есть постарел я, а не Соня. Она бодра и работает много в огороде, на покосе и так далее.
And now we move to the letter dated as 25th of July 1920, okay? Of course, they have aged. That is, I have aged, not Sonia. She is cheerful and works a lot in the garden, moving, etc.
Следующий слайд.
Next slide.
Не менее интересными являются воспоминания современников, друзей семьи Кропоткиных. Самым ярким являются воспоминания известного скульптора Ильи Гинзбурга, давнего знакомого Кропоткина, который приезжал в Лондон для работы над скульптурным изображением Петра Алексеевича. А в 1920 году осенью они снова встретились уже в Дмитрове. Вот небольшой отрывочек из этих воспоминаний.
The most vivid is the memories of the famous sculptor Ilya Efimовich Ginsburg, an old friend of Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin, who came to London to work on the sculptural image of Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin. And in the autumn of 1920, they met again in Dmitrov. Here is a small excerpt from these memories. Next slide, please.
Тот самый бюст. Скажите.
This is that very image, sculptural image of Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin made in Dmitrov in the autumn of 1920.
В конце октября 1920 года я снова увиделся с Кропоткиным, на этот раз уже в России. Я поехал к нему для того, чтобы вылепить с него бюст, этюд для бюста, который заказал мне Центральный географический музей. Поездка в Дмитров, где жил Кропоткин, оказалась делом не очень легким. Трудно было попасть в поезд, переполненный пассажирами и их багажом, и пришлось все время стоять в духоте и тесноте. Но зато, добравшись наконец до Дмитрова, я был вознагражден за неудобства в пути. Свежий осенний воздух привел меня в себя. Восхитил меня красивый великорусский городок. Он расположен в неровной, живописной местности, все утопает в зелени, и после лета, проведенного мною в городе, я здесь почувствовал всю прелесть русской природы. В одной из верхних улиц города, внутри красивого садика, уютно расположен дом-дача, в котором жил Кропоткин. Никого дома не было. Идя по садику, я попал на открытое место, огород, и там увидел Софью Григорьевну. Она копала картофель. «Вот видите, — заговорила она, — на старости лет приходится работать на земле, и руки не могу вам подать, зато овощи будут на весь год».
Okay, so here is a small extract from the memories of the sculptor Ginsburg. At the end of October 1920, I saw Kropotkin again, this time in Russia. I went to him in order to sculpt a sketch from him for a bust, from the bust that for the Central Geographical Museum had ordered for me. The trip to Dmitrov, where Kropotkin lived, turned out to be not very easy. It was difficult to get on the train, crowded with passengers and their luggage, and I had to stand in the stuffy and cramped it all the time. But when I finally got to Dmitrov, I was rewarded for the inconvenience on the way. The fresh autumn air brought me to myself. I was delighted by the beautiful Velikoruski town. It is located in an uneven, picturesque area. Everything is surrounded by greenery, and after a summer spent a lot in the city, I felt all the charm of Russian nature here. In one of the upper streets of the city, inside a beautiful garden, there is a cozy dacha house where Kropotkin lived. No one was at home. Walking through the garden, I came to an open place, a vegetable garden, and there I saw Sofia Grigorievna, Kropotkin's wife. She was digging potatoes. You see, she said, in my old age, I have to work on the land, and I can't give you my hands. In the morning, I eat potatoes. The whole garden is my work, and there will be vegetables for the whole year.
Следующие 2 слайда.
Next 2 slides, please. 16 and 17.
Да. С этими воспоминаниями перекликаются воспоминания Эммы Гольдман и Александра Бергмана, которые в 1920 году, в последний год жизни Кропоткина, приехали к нему в Дмитров. И вообще 1920 год, последний год жизни Кропоткина, стал для него годом визитов. В Дмитровском доме гостят родственники анархиста Александра Шапира и Александра Табекяна. В июле к Петру Алексеевичу снова приезжают Гольдман и Бергман. Старик выглядел бодрее и лучше, чем в марте. В его глазах блестели искры жизни. В солнечном свете и тепле дом и сад выглядели идеалистически. С большой гордостью Петр говорил о садоводческих навыках своей подруги и своих собственных, вспоминала Эмма. Взяв Сашу, имеется в виду Бергмана, и меня под руки, он с мальчишеским восторгом подвел нас к грядке, где Софья выращивала особый сорт латука. Ей удалось вырастить его размером с капусту. Листья были хрустящими и сочными. Он тоже копался в земле, повторял он, но именно Софья была настоящим экспертом в этом деле. Ее урожай картофеля, минувшей зимой, был настолько велик, что оставалось достаточно для того, чтобы обменять его на корм для коровы и даже поделиться с соседями по Дмитрову, у которых было мало овощей. Наш дорогой Петр резвился в своем саду и говорил об этих вещах так, как будто это были мировые события.
So very interesting memories. These memories are echoed by the memories of Emma Goldman, who came to Kropotkin together with Alexander Beckman. 1920, the last year of Kropotkin's life, became for him a year of visits. Relatives of anarchists Alexander Shapiro and Alexander Tabekyan are staying at the Dmitrov house. In July, Goldman and Bergman came to Peter Alexeyevich again. The old man looked more cheerful and better than in March. There were sparks of life in his eyes. The house and garden looked idyllic in the sunshine and warmth. Peter spoke with great pride about his girlfriend's gardening skills and his own. Emma recalled taking Sasha Beckman and me by the arms. He led us with boyish delight to the garden where Sophia was growing a special kind of lettuce. She managed to grow it in the size of cabbage. The leaves were crisp and juicy. She also dug in the ground, he repeated, but it was Sophia who was the real expert in this matter. Her potato harvest last winter was so large that there was enough left to exchange it for cow feed and even share it with neighbors in Dmitrov who had few vegetables. Our dear Peter frolicked in his garden and talked about these things as if they were world events. Next slide, please.
Даже после смерти Петра Алексеевича знакомые семьи продолжали интересоваться сельскохозяйственными делами Софьи Григорьевны. В письме Марии Николаевны Слепцовой из Парижа, которое имеет датировку 20-е годы, есть такие слова. «Напиши мне, родная, что ты делаешь летом? Работаешь ли на огороде?»
So, even after the death of Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin, families continued to be interested in the agricultural affairs of Sofia Grigorievna. In a letter from Maria Nikolaevna Sliptsova from Paris, dating from the 20th, there are these words. Write to me, my dear. What are you doing in this summer? Do you work in the garden? Next slides, please.
И еще один
And
следующий.
another yet one. Okay, thank you.
Эта цитата, как и все предыдущие, позволяет нам с уверенностью сделать вывод о том, что работа на огороде для членов семьи Петра Алексеевича Кропоткина была привычным и необходимым делом, которым весьма почтенные как в смысле возраста, так и в смысле социальной принадлежности люди занимались увлеченно.
This quote, like all the previous ones, allow us to conclude with confidence that working in the garden for members of the family of Piotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin was a familiar and necessary task, which very respectable people, both in terms of age and in terms of social affiliation, were engaged in enthusiastically. Next slide.
Особенно интересно представлять человека не только с точки зрения того величия, которую он прочно занял в сознании многих людей. Гораздо интереснее открывать в нем чисто человеческие черты, присущие большинству людей. В этом плане небольшое знакомство с сельскохозяйственными увлечениями Петра Алексеевича и Софьи Григорьевны является бесценным материалом.
So we conclude with such words. It is especially interesting to represent a person not only from the point of view of his greatness that he has firmly occupied in the minds of many people. It is much more interesting to discover in him purely human traits inherent in most people. In this regard, a little acquaintance with the agricultural hobbies of Piotr Alexeyevich and Sofia Grigorievna is invaluable material. Thank you very much for your attention.
Спасибо.
Thanks a lot for this presentation. It was really interesting.
You're welcome.
Спасибо.
If that's okay, we will keep the question for the end after Shaun's presentation to have a better discussion.
Мы оставляем все вопросы до конца выступления Шона. Okay?
Да.
We quite agree with you.
Хорошо.
Well, thank you. So Shaun, if you want to get started on your own presentation, and thank you.
Hey. Yeah, let me just share my screen. Here we go. Yes, you can all see.
Yes.
And can everyone hear me okay as well? Yeah, looks like it. Perfect. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to my talk. As Adeline mentioned earlier on, I'm a PhD student at Northumbria University here in Britain, and specifically my thesis is on the overlap between new liberal and anarchist networks at the beginning of the 20th century. But this paper today focuses on, not entirely, but quite a different venture that I started during my PhD, which is that of the Kropotkin Papers. From looking at Kropotkin's non-anarchist connections in various archives, but especially the State Archive of the Russian Federation, which was mentioned by Natalia, is often referred to as GARF, which is the acronym. I found a vast network of individuals in his correspondence in a plethora of different locations, occupations, and nationalities. This is very much a work in progress that I hope I will be able to more fully commit to as I suspend or complete my PhD in the next 6 months. So please appreciate that in some areas it is a little unfinished. I will just give you a short look at the website. I'm hoping that the link works. Perfect. Yeah, so basically the website, it has loads of different posts that are summaries of Kropotkin's letters on it so far. And here are some of the posts we have already from Liam O'Rinn, who was the writer of the Irish National Anthem, an Irish nationalist, and some scientists like J. Arthur Thompson, and Edward Vestermark is a sociologist, Emily Hobhouse is an anti-Boer war and pacifist, and to a lesser extent, women's rights activist, and some kind of editorial journalism as editorial correspondence as well. And yeah, CBM Roundtree is a land reformer. So this gives you a general idea of what is on there already. It's not been very active for the last week or so because I've been very busy, but I'm hoping as the PhD winds down, I'll be able to focus on it more and give it more of my time. I think it's not in full screen anymore. There we go, perfect. So, first I will quickly summarize the origins of the Kropotkin Papers. During the first half of my PhD, I planned a long and elaborate trip to Russia, and especially to the State Archive of the Russian Federation, which is pictured here. And I even memorized how to say it in Russian, which was not that easy, as you can imagine by the words. And my plan was to consult Kropotkin's papers in May 2020. Unfortunately, the pandemic rendered this trip impossible, which led me to recruit a number of research assistants in Moscow to photograph and send me items of correspondence to Kropotkin. At first, I was quite disappointed with this arrangement because I didn't get to visit Russia, but it also led to my possession of a vast number of photographs of letters I would likely have not taken on the day, which led me to think of this project. And pictured here is an example of one of these photographs, a letter from Japanese anarchist Kotoku Denjiro, which I probably butchered the pronunciation of there. Apologies if there are any Japanese speakers in the chat. And he was very important to the introduction of anarchism to Japan. This process of getting research assistants to take photographs and saving them, uploading them, etc., brought its own logistical problems, however. And one obvious one, as you can see from this picture, is that photographing a microfilm reader, and often quite an old microfilm reader, can be problematic. For now, the website summarizes interesting findings from archives relating to Kropotkin and his family, but I hope one day to also vastly improve awareness of Sophie Kropotkin's life through this website. But I would like in the general future of the website to give a better geographical picture of Kropotkin's broader networks, especially those anarchist networks, and something slightly akin to Tom Goyen's work on the mapping of the anarchist movement, an example of which is pictured here. So this map shows the distribution of the German language anarchist newspaper Freiheit, which was originally based in London, but moved to America in 1882. This shows in some ways the kind of interesting questions, and I mean questions rather than answers, that this work produces, which I hope to produce. Questions like, who is this person in Hawaii or Namibia reading a German anarchist newspaper in the 1890s? But a key part of these kind of digital humanities projects tends to be, at the very least, the production of these new lines of inquiry, and in many cases, answers to these questions. The other aspiration for the Kropotkin Papers is to be something like the Jane Addams Papers Project, which is a university-affiliated website to document and map the interconnected networks of Jane Addams, a prominent American pacifist, women's rights activist, social reformer, social worker, and probably a lesbian as well, pictured here on the left. Her home, Hull House, in Chicago, was an important meeting place for a variety of radicals in America, and Kropotkin, who was a friend of Addams, would stay there during his tour of the USA in 1901. Volunteers at the project, the Jane Addams Project that is, transcribed letters to and from Addams to give a better summary of the interconnected political network that she participated in. We can see pictured here a list of letters that Kropotkin is mentioned in. And as you can see, they mostly relate to 1901 during his visit to the city. But also there is one letter on the site that is received by Jane Addams from Kropotkin. And also there are two written by Kropotkin to Jane Addams, and one I think received by Kropotkin. Yeah, the received by is a letter from Jane Addams to Kropotkin. That was surprisingly complex. But the way the website works is that all of these letters are digitized. This is not a link, but you can click on these and just look straight at the letter. And a lot of them have been transcribed, and it means that it basically makes Adam's life very easy to investigate as a researcher, which is something I'd like for Kropotkin's life to be more like. And insights like those provided in the James Adams paper project will greatly help further research into Kropotkin and his contemporaries. For much of my PhD research, I was already completing this work, and I have taken a few extra notes to start the process to chart interesting things from his correspondence. Ignore the most frequent correspondence, that's not meant to come up yet. Yeah, so a quick disclaimer should be that this little table is from a relatively small sample size and is only from 200 pages of letters that are focused in the area of my PhD research. And again, it is all from the main repository of Kropotkin's papers, the State Archive of the Russian Federation. But the first table gives you an impression of the kind of things I intend to chart further in the future. From my general knowledge around Kropotkin and his networks, I would imagine, however, that these top three will remain the same, but possibly in a different order. He did personally love fields, factories, and workshops, and mutual aid, most of all, and referred to them as his Mädchen, which is little girls in German, as he was writing to a German friend at the time. And again, I apologize if I pronounced that horrendously. And the second table, which is taken from data extracted from the archive catalogue at the State Archive, also gives us an indication of some of the closest personal contacts he had. I personally find the inclusion of his older brother amongst the highest number of letters quite interesting. I mentioned during our opening remarks that he committed suicide in 1890, and Alexander, being Piotr's older brother, was someone that Piotr looked up to very much as a young man. And Alexander himself personally held quite moderate political views and felt that he was being imprisoned because of his brother's participation in radical networks. It is likely that Kropotkin's family donated the letters between the brothers, and that therefore Kropotkin personally held on to these letters from the 1850s and up until 1871, when the last letter in the archive was received, for nearly 60 years. Sophie and Alexandra, his wife and daughter, are unsurprisingly also in the top three. But the sheer quantity of letters from his wife is revealing. Nearly 15% of his entire archive are letters from Sophie. And you may also notice Maria Goldsmith there in the list, the anarchist biologist anyone listening to the last papers of yesterday will be well aware of. It is partly for this reason that I was also surprised there is so little work about her life and her relationship with Kropotkin. But also we have the liberal geographer John Scott Kelty, Christian socialist activist Richard Heath, and the influential anarchist James Guillaume. This small sample of most frequent correspondence sending letters to Kropotkin showed the variety of heterogeneous and overlapping networks he was participating in. The real significance is the vast number of individuals that he has a very small number of letters from, however. And even from, oh, there's the thing at the bottom. Yeah, so the 15% is that it's 30,000 sheets of letters in the Garth, and 4,300 of them from Sophie Kropotkin. I should say as well, I think I mentioned this later on, but now's a good time to say it, is that the way that the Garth classifies a sheet is that it's literally a page of paper. So normally A5 shape. Actually, I've kind of got an A5 paper in front of me. Normally about this size, maybe slightly smaller, but it can be both sides. So a sheet can vary in that you can have a very small piece of text, or it could be quite a large, or even an A4 page would count as a sheet as well. So that does vary significantly. Oh, I've lost my... Yeah, here we go. Even from quite shallow data extracted from the archives catalogue, we can find some interesting insights into the overall collections and therefore to the personal networks of Piotr Kropotkin. So as I mentioned before, he has over 30,000 sheets of letters in the State Archive alone, spread across over 3,000 different folders, with most individuals only having one folder. There's a lot of loud sound that's on the window, but hopefully it's not too bad. Yeah, with most individuals only have one folder for their letters. The only individuals that have more than one tend to be the ones I mentioned before: his wife, his daughter, his brother. Maria Goldsmith has 3 or 4 as well, which leaves us with an average of around 10 sheets of letter per individual. Thank you, Adeline. They've gone now anyway. It was a bin lorry. And the truth of it is that there are actually hundreds of individuals from whom Kropotkin received very few letters, and in many of these cases it is difficult to decipher who they are without viewing the letters themselves, as the details on the archive catalogue are quite brief, often filled with typos, and sometimes just incorrect. So an untangling of this is actually quite useful for researchers, and I plan one day to publish a very detailed guide to Kropotkin's papers, including information about visiting the archive in person. But back to the data. From his correspondence, I've identified different individuals at over 100 universities, ranging from all over the world, but especially in Britain, Germany, Russia, and the USA. The universities with multiple individuals are mostly in Britain, however, and centre around Cambridge, Oxford, King's College London, and Edinburgh. He had particularly strong connections within global academic networks, both professional and non-professional, that are reflected in his correspondence with a broad variety of different specialists in his own disciplines, but also in a plethora of other fields, and especially in the natural sciences. I have also noted many individuals involved in the Irish nationalist movement, the Zionist movement, and members of 40 different political parties from all over the world. Some much rougher data I have here also speaks to how much of Kropotkin's correspondence centers around the English-speaking networks that he was part of. The graph on the left, which is simply extracted from the archives data, shows what percentage of his letters were in each language. And as you can see, English is very dominant within that. And the graph on the right, which was mostly researched by myself, shows the location of these correspondents, the ones that I can work out anyway. It also, these two together speak to how English was becoming, at least for Kropotkin and his networks, the second language of the world around this time. And both indicate that these archives could be quite useful for research in activist networks in the Anglophone world during his lifetime. And from looking at the archives, I can tell that English was the language that he would personally use to communicate with a massive variety of nationalities. He'd use this to communicate personally with his Colombian, Egyptian, Finnish, Italian, Polish, Sri Lankan, and Japanese contacts. And yeah, and just one quick note: the reason it says Russian likely is that the archive catalogue specifies when the letters are in English and French and German, Italian. There's even a few Swedish, Portuguese, that kind of thing, but it doesn't specify when they're in Russian. So the ones that are in Russian, it doesn't say anything, so it's likely Russian. Going forward, I hope to confirm addresses of individuals and then pinpoint locations within, possibly even within miles or even the exact location, especially in Britain, where many of the roads haven't changed that much since Kropotkin's time. Obviously in America, this is significantly more difficult. And then create a map of the locations of the correspondence, similar to the one I showed you on an earlier slide. Knowing where his correspondents were, especially when many are clustered together, gives us an indication of possible hotspots of anarchistic activity, but also reveals some interesting connections and examples we hadn't thought of. For example, these examples are less statistically significant, but offer a rare glimpse into Kropotkin's connections in the global south. We have a letter here from an admirer of his work in Iran, who is congratulating him on his return home in 1917. And a letter from a Brazilian publication based in Rio de Janeiro, which I can't read, unfortunately, because I think it's in Portuguese or it's in French. And lastly, a letter from Sri Lankan Buddhist revivalist Anagarika Dharmapala, who is building a school in India. While these letters give us insights into his personal network, they also help us understand his personal life in a way that even his memoirs do not reveal. As Natalia's touched on, there are very personal stories that you don't really get from any published writings. And this can range from interesting stories about the way he related to his close family members, how close he was to individuals he would only collaborate with on work matters, but also sometimes his more polemical or honest side. They reveal the effect of exiled life on him, as we can see here from his letter he wrote to Bernhard Kampfmeyer in 1907. His correspondence can also be more useful to see his private opinions about ideas and philosophies that don't make it into published work. For example, this quote about the German cytologist August Weissmann that I mentioned briefly yesterday goes much further than any criticism of Marx I am aware of in any of his written work. Describing August Weissmann, he calls him the Karl Marx of biology, who is just as superficial, making grandissima generalizations on a handful of facts. I find it interesting also that he says grandissima, which is obviously Italian, to Marie Goldsmith, who is born in Russia, but I think would speak French much more comfortably. But also these letters provide the odd visualization for the way that Kropotkin thought about things and for the practicalities of his mind. As we can see in the bottom right here, a diagram of a greenhouse using the Channel Islands to grow fruit and vegetables more efficiently. And as Natalia discussed as well, growing vegetables and fruit is something that Kropotkin was interested in his whole life, and that his wife is also very keenly interested in. And his time in the Channel Islands, as you can see from his letters, are a time that he was very excited about because they used more advanced horticultural methods than we did in Britain, and probably more than he'd seen in Russia as well in his own time. And in the bottom left, there is a chart of Kropotkin's view of revolutionary progress, but specifically the evolutionary and revolutionary progress of the French Revolution. We see the rising progression of the French Revolution with some problems along the way, culminating in 1793, and then the counter-revolution and repression that followed, and the authoritarianism that Kropotkin would have described. But it's important to note that Kropotkin eventually and intentionally puts the status quo as higher up on this evolutionary graph, as he felt that even after this painful and ultimately unsuccessful event, progressive forces had made progress. Anyway, I hope that the Kropotkin Papers will accomplish a variety of things. I hope that it stimulates research, helps us better understand Kropotkin, the man and his heterogeneous networks, but also draw deeper conclusions about his ideas, their origins, and their distribution. But as ever with a project like this, however, I imagine that the multifarious ways in which it might be useful are completely unclear now and will become clear at a later date. I would like to acknowledge the great contribution to this project that my research assistants in Moscow have provided, especially Andrei Gornosteyev, who will be our chair for this afternoon's panel with Dmitry Ivanov and Sergei Saitanov and Nikolai Gerasimov, as it wouldn't have been possible without them, but especially without Andrei. If you would like to help get involved, please email me at this email address, kropotkinpapers@gmail.com, and please follow us on Twitter at Kropotkin Papers if you simply would like to keep apprised of the project. We are especially looking for volunteers who can help translate letters from French or Russian. And thank you so much for listening to my paper.
Thank you so much. It was really, really great and interesting. So now we'll leave the floor to discussion. If people prefer to type in the chat, they can, but please, if you feel comfortable doing so, don't hesitate to ask sharing your audio and video to just ask your questions directly. Or if speakers have questions for each other's or remark or comments for a start, please go ahead.
So,
Очень интересно,
Shaun,
да.
thank you so much for
Очень
your
интересно.
brilliant, very interesting, great, really great presentation. And would you please remind us what university do you present?
I'm at Northumbria University.
Northumbria, okay.
It's in Newcastle, Newcastle upon Tyne. Oh, you've heard of it. There are a few like Russian specialists, not many of Kropotkin, but normally there are a few Tolstoyan specialists at my university. My supervisor, Charlotte Alston, may be someone you're familiar with.
Thank you.
И еще такой вопрос. Кроме Государственного архива Российской Федерации, он пользовался другими архивами для вот сведения такого большого статистического материала?
So, your statistic material is enormous one, and will you say, except Gov in Moscow, what other archives did you manage to the materials from what archives did you manage to contain, to study and to analyze and to put in your presentation?
So I don't mention them much. The presentation is mainly focused on Garth, but I've utilised letters to and from Kropotkin. Here in Britain, most of the letters are from Kropotkin, and my PhD focuses on his influence on other people. So I was looking at letters that he received. Obviously, most of those are in Russia, but I've also used archives, not physically, but I've received archival material from Finland. A little bit from Sweden, I've got a few letters from Dublin in Ireland as well. I'm aware of letters in Germany in the Central Archives, and so I have a German helper who's gone a bit quiet recently, but he's based in Germany and will. Yes, and of course Dmitrov Ivanov in the chat is correct. I've also used his letters in the IISH, but I would say the ones in the IISH, the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, are they're nearly all about him and his brother's relationship, and they're all in Russian. So while I found them interesting, they weren't useful at all for my PhD. There are letters between him and other prominent anarchists as well, like Tamela Nieuwenhuis. But yeah, the Amsterdam one is useful actually. Yeah, and a lot of them are digitized as well. The ones in Amsterdam.
So, Shaun, there is a phrase in English, to read for exam, not to prepare, but to read for exam. And I'd like to say that you are a brilliant student because you have read so much materials, a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think also that this speaks personally to I'm much more interested in the papers than I am in a lot of ways to the what's the word? To the actual writing and finishing a PhD. I find it much more exciting and interesting to chart Kropotkin's papers.
Спасибо.
Thank
Здорово.
you.
Отлично.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Thank you
Спасибо.
for your Russian.
Спасибо. Так, ну у нас нет вопросов, да,
Yeah.
получается?
We are empty with our questions. All questions have.
There are some questions in the chat. So the first one, I don't know if you kind of answered it, Shaun, already. Ask, is there much of Kropotkins in IISH in Amsterdam? You're muted.
I realised. I touched on it a bit in my question, but I think I spoke of it too soon. In that the things in the IISH that say that they're Kropotkin's papers specifically are all copies they were given by Garth, so they're all already in Garth. Number one. Number two, they nearly all relate to his brother and or are from his brother, and therefore from the 1870s. I was quite interested because, and also you can't photograph any of the items because of them being from Garth originally, which didn't help with my keeping it and being able to distribute it, that kind of thing. But there are letters from Kropotkin into different collections. So, for example, Tamela Nieuwenhuis is a Dutch anarchist, Christian anarchist. I'm not sure if that's a fair description, but so his papers have letters from Kropotkin, and I think there are a few others where the papers from Kropotkin are in there as well. Maybe Max Netlau's papers have them as well. So I would say there's a small amount, and that his own papers aren't that useful unless you're looking very specifically at his relationship with his brother or his like early origins of some of his ideas, because him and his brother were both scientists and discussed kind of scientific ideas a lot as well. So.
Thank you. So we have another question asking, are there any big names from the letters from Dublin? You're muted again.
Yeah. I should just not mute myself next time. So it like I was trying to find my spreadsheet for the Irish archives just to have a quick look because I think I found it. But like the biggest name that not everyone, but most people have heard, I think it's actually, give me a second. Is Keats Irish? Am I remembering that correctly? Sorry, give me 1 second and then I can.
In the meantime, I saw that Tom had a question for Natalia. If you're looking, should we move to the next question when you're having a look?
I'll come back.
Tom, did you want to ask it directly, or do you want me to read?
If you can hear me, I can ask directly.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so it's to both Shaun and Natalia. And I was asking that I'm particularly interested in both Peter and Sophie's vegetable growing, and was wondering if the letters are available anywhere online or are they just in the archives? And also Natalia asked something, she mentioned something about a lecture that Sophie gave on horticulture. So is this available anywhere online as well?
Oh, I think they're muted. I think Natalia is muted. No?
I don't know, because when I look at the option, it just said I can mute them, which is weird.
Can you try and unmute Tatiana? Oh, no, Natalia, your review. There should be a little picture of a microphone below the videos. Oh dear. We can hear you now.
Да. С вами.
So, could you please repeat the question from the chat? The last one to Natalia about vegetables.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the letters were available online anywhere or if they're just in the archives in Moscow. And also the same question about Sophie's lecture on horticulture.
Вернее, не лекция наша, которую вы читали.
Нет, будет доступно, да.
Yes, this lecture, Natalia, will be available online.
Она есть у организаторов конференции.
Actually speaking, organizers of this conference got it already.
Can someone send a link in the chat, maybe?
I think, Tatiana, I think Tom is asking about Sophie Kropotkin's lecture.
Софи Кропоткинс?
По-русски.
Софи Кропоткин лекция у нас есть?
Эта лекция, она есть, но она находится в стадии сейчас изучения, написания к ней комментариев, поэтому выложить пока мы ее не можем.
Of course, this lecture is available, but a little bit later, please, because now it is in scientific, so to say, studying, and we are getting ready with the comments. We are getting ready with the comments to this lecture, and after this, it will be available.
И мы готовим издание сборника писем Кропоткина, сейчас этим заняты, и вот таких вот документов.
The last but not least, we are preparing, so to say, the book of Kropotkin's letters soon, and will include all the heritage we
Работа Софьи
got, and also the work, the paper of Sofia Grigorьevna. But we need time. Okay.
I was just going to add to that that there are very few places where Sophie Kropotkin's letters to or from Kropotkin from Piotr have been digitized. They're nearly always physically. You have to go to them physically. I think because a lot of researchers historically have not been interested in their personal relationship. Not that I think they should be, obviously, for many reasons. And also, people often say things to their spouse they wouldn't say to, someone that they work with. I just wanted to return to Niall's question. It was Yeats. I was trying to remember Yeats. He's got a letter from Kropotkin to Yeats in 1904, Most of them centre around an Irish anarchist journalist, Danny Florence Dryhurst, who moved back to Dublin when she was very old and passed away there. But Yeats was a big fan of Kropotkin. They corresponded a little bit. I think Kropotkin came to the performance of a Yeats play or something once, or I guess a poem.
Okay.
А что ты спрашиваешь?
Dmitry, did you have a question? Otherwise, I think Ole had one in the chat.
Oh, we lost Dmitry.
Well, so I guess I will ask the one in the chat from Ole. Slightly off topic, but since you're all archivists, are there any archives of Kropotkin's scientific writings, like his columns Recent Science in the 9th century, where mutual aid also came out first, etc.? Most published stuff focuses on his political activism, but I'd love to have a better access to his science writing, besides mutual aid. If not, can you please make it happen?
So there is a thing called like the complete Kropotkin bibliography, that doesn't link to they're not all digitized, but some of them are. If you Google that, it will come up. I would say it's not absolutely complete, but it is incredibly long and detailed. And many of them, if you click them, they take a link to a publication. The 19th century as well, which Ollie mentions, is also not very digitized. Certainly not nowhere near as digitized as most of the publications from its time period. I had quite a difficulty getting to it. So I think that that would take a long time. But that website does have quite a few of the 19th century ones digitized. So. Just not to confuse you, the 19th century was also a publication that ran 18-something to 1910, I think. A funny story is that someone bought the rights to the name 20th century, and so they couldn't call it that without paying this person a lot of money. But it often is confused by the actual century.
Thank you. I don't know if I missed any in the chat, but does anyone have any other question, comments, would want to discuss something?
I think Dmitry did. Do you want to write in the chat or try and join again, Dmitry?
Dmitry said, sorry, I had no question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I had no question. I went to a quick question of Natalia, if that's okay. I guess I have two questions, but they're both very easy. The first one is... Vопроsi, I remember the word vопроsi. I have two questions. What was Kropotkin's cat called? Is the first one.
Will you repeat Kropotkin's
cat? Cot.
Cat?
Да. Значит, действительно, на памятнике работы скульптора Рукавишникова изначально был рядом с Петром Алексеевичем изображен кот.
Originally, on the monument of sculpture Rukavishnikov, there was a cat.
Последний слайд нашего.
And the last slide of our presentation is just about it.
What was his name? Sorry.
It was.
Но внучатый племянник Кропоткина, живущий, внук Кропоткина, живущий в городе Дмитрове, попросил этого кота убрать.
But a very interesting detail. The grandson of Piotr Alexeyevich Kropotkin, living in Dmitrov, kindly requested us to remove this cat.
Только вчера я с ним на эту тему разговаривала, и он подтвердил вот именно эти слова свои.
And just yesterday, Natalia Yurovna had a talk with the grandson of Peter Alexeyevich Kropotkin, and he confirmed his words. So it was his kind request to remove the cat at all.
Да. Да.
So did Kropotkin have a cat, and what was the cat's name?
И было у него имя какое-то?
Нет,
No.
вообще мы этой истории мы вообще не знаем, как бы
No.
сказать.
We haven't slightest idea about this story.
И, скорее всего, Рукавишников, ну, как бы сказать, взял один из символов безгосударственного устройства общества, кот, гуляющий сам по себе.
And the idea may be like this, that sculptor Rukavishnikov took this cat as a symbol. So this is not a real but symbolic cat as a symbol of anarchism. So a cat freely going anywhere.
They are very anarchist cats in their outlook, I would say. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I don't see any more questions.
Laura has a question, I think.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Apologies. Lara, do you want to share your audio and video, or do you want to type the question?
Ну, тогда, может, прощаться мы будем.
Maybe we finish our discussion. What do you think about it?
I think Laura has one question for you. I think she's typing it in the chat right now, I think. And then we can end after that if you want.
Okay.
Надо же про кота. Вот хорошо, что я вчера поливала все. Да.
Он сейчас там что-то говорил. Кому-то запись была.
Вот, да. Второй вопрос, да?
Нет, это чуть-чуть.
Он сказал два вопроса.
А это Томас Пилтон. Это вот тот, как Томас Пилтон, я не знаю, подключался. So, where is the question, Shaun?
She just posted it. How did Sophia's garden continue after Peter's death? Was there a connection to the museum?
Ага. Как София в дальнейшем поддерживалась с музеем после смерти Кропоткина, то есть, каким образом вообще осуществлялась дальше ее деятельность в связи с музеем?
Значит, дом Кропоткина до ее ухода из жизни 15 декабря 1941 года оставался в неприкосновенности в Дмитрове.
So, we would like to stress it that up to the death of Sofia Grigorievna on 15th of December of 1941, the house in Dmitrov was undisturbed. It was preserved just as during Peter Kropotkin's life.
После смерти Петра Алексеевича она открыла в Москве, в доме, где он родился, музей.
After Peter Kropotkin's death, after her husband's death, Sofia Grigorievna had opened in Moscow, in the house where he had been born, the museum.
Значит, в 1937 году она подарила этот музей государству.
And in 1937, Sofia Grigorievna Kropotkina presented this museum to the state.
И судьба его неизвестна. В разных музеях находятся части его коллекции.
And so to say, the fate of this museum is unknown up to now because the heritage was moved to different museums after her death. Have you any questions? More questions?
Thank you. I don't see any more questions, but if there is any, would you mind sharing maybe your email address where you can be contacted? in the chat if people have questions to email you, maybe.
Ну, они как-то могут нам что-то писать. но ничего.
Конечно, пусть
Okay,
пишут, да,
okay, of
да, да.
course.
Почта наша есть у организаторов
Yeah.
конференции, да.
You're welcome. And we thank you for this very thorough discussion. Yes.
И приглашаем,
And for
конечно, в музей.
enthusiasm, for your enthusiasm, for your talent, and for your work. And of course, we welcome all of you to our unique and the only one museum of Piotr Kropotkin in
Потому что
Dmitrov.
мы единственные в мире
Because
музей.
we would like to point it once again, to stress it, that our museum is the only one in the world. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Thanks, everyone. And so we meet back, if you want, at 1 p.m. for the mid-conference informal discussion. And then the next session will start at 1:30 and will be about war, conflict, and revolution. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great lunch break.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. Good luck.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.
Андрей, отключайте нас. Спасибо. Фух, ну, мы молодцы. 2 часа продержались, Татьяна Николаевна. Вам просто благодарность.